This was one of the videos recorded for one of the meetings at Christi at UTSA. Aside from a few minor edits to clean up the long pauses, it's virtually the exact same video, but in any case, here's the video. Hope y'all enjoy.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Tim Howard, founder of Worldview Mastery, where he helps Christians strengthen their thinking and deepen their understanding of the Christian worldview. Let me just see if we're recording here real quick. Yeah, we are. Okay. Tim brings over a decade of experience in Christian philosophy and apologetics, equipping believers to think more clearly and confidently about the truth, faith, and reason. Through teachings, videos, and thoughtful engagement, he's helped countless people grow in biblical thinking and intellectual maturity. You might know him for dismantling Alex O'Connor's problem of evil on Jubilee with his notorious axiological expectation mismatch problem. But in any case, please join me in welcoming Tim Howard.
Thank you. Super excited to be here. Super grateful to be here. All I have is gratitude to be presenting to everybody today. This is a topic that I am extremely passionate about. It's changed my faith, not just intellectually, but it's allowed me to have more experiential resonance with just the beliefs I already hold. And so that's my goal for you guys today, is to liberate you, which is some of these findings that I've seen. And the Trinity is a really big topic. So I don't want to waste any time. I want to hop right into it. The Trinity is in the Bible. This is probably one of the most disputed and most objected to claims that any other alternative faith to Christianity can articulate. And actually, it's even kind of controversial within the Christian faith for a number of reasons. I want to get into that right now. First, the biblical Trinity is not what you think. I want all of you right now listening, either Christian or non-Christian. I really don't know what the group today is made up of, so I'm not going to assume anything, but I want you to forget every single thing you know about the Trinity up to this point. Okay? I want you to understand the second point here, which is that the Trinity found in Scripture, and yes, I am defending the contention that the Trinity is in Scripture itself. The doctrine of the Trinity in this strong sense is in the Scriptures, is not the Trinity, though, that you are usually thinking of or talking about. All the analogies between the different phases of matter, all of the debates you hear online about complex philosophical frameworks, that is not what I'm talking about. And as this slideshow progresses, you will see exactly what I mean. Okay. I want to set some expectations. After this presentation, you will be able to defend the Trinity purely from the biblical text and the biblical worldview, meaning the consciousness found within the Bible, within our scriptures, of those within our scriptures and what they believed. That is what I mean there. Two, you will be able to defend against objections to this model, and a big part of this will be Q&A. A lot of the things I do with my community members is I'm huge on questions, and I like to say that all questions are permissible, but not all questions are profitable. And a big part of philosophical investigation, or just rational investigation in general, is the ability to know what questions actually yield fruit. Listen, I'm not going to dog in on anyone for asking this particular question, but all questions lead to good places, and knowing what those dead ends are and what those dead ends aren't is going to be super helpful. And so knowing how to clarify objections is going to really depend on you guys today. So I want, even if you're someone in the crowd who's like, man, I agreed with every single thing that Tim said, I could not endorse it more, please be thinking of questions to ask, right? There are always growth areas that we can have. And then the third is you'll be able to sidestep any weird philosophical conundrums raised by other faiths against the logic of the Trinity. And I know that's probably going to be a big one for most people. Okay, so my contention is that I'll be defending two stances, that there is a distinctly Jewish understanding of the Trinity within the scriptures themselves, and two, that the Apostle Paul was himself a full-fledged Trinitarian. That is what I'll be defending. So let's start with what the Christian actually believes. We have this common Trinitarian diagram here. The Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit is not the Father, and vice versa, but they are each equally and fully God. We say that God is a Trinity, and the Trinity is just a term that was coined in later centuries that basically just means triunity. There's a unity between three, And in this sense, their unity is in what's usually thought of as in nature. And they are three in personhood. So you have the Father, Son, and Spirit. That's usually how people think of the Trinity. And that is what I'm going to be asking you not to think about today. And the second is just that God became incarnate, and God the Son incarnated as Jesus Christ. I mean that the Son, God the Son, took on a human flesh, human body, became embodied, known as Jesus Christ, and that Jesus is God. These are the core claims of the Christian. Okay, moving on. There are some common concerns here. When people hear me say, and this is taking place in common parlance, that when I say the Trinity is in the Bible, they're thinking of this in the creedal sense. They're thinking of these complex philosophical frameworks that center around substance, essence, talk, hypostatic union, hypostasis, consubstantiality. These are terms that are talked about 3rd century and so on in councils like Chalcedon, Nicaea, Constantinople, all these different things. And they think that it commits this fallacy of anachronism. That's basically where you can import a modern meaning of a word or a concept, and what you do is you impose it on how it was originally understood in an earlier setting. And it's going to be fallacious, because all a fallacy is an error in reasoning. It's going to be fallacious because to impose a modern understanding that's disconnected from its original context, where the original understanding was different, is, well, just fails to align with reason. And when we read the Bible, people think, okay, well, if I just open up my Bible here, like I have right here, I should be able to find language of consubstantiality and hypostatic union and substances and persons. And guess what happens? You actually can't find those things. They're not written there. They're not articulated by any people in the Bible. And so an example, right? Another example is going to be, like, let's say there's a painting of the birth of Jesus, but then there's like a crucifix somewhere, like in the painting. Like that doesn't make, like there's a chronological mismatch there. So we want to avoid anachronism. And so when I say that the Trinity is in the Bible, I don't mean of the kind that is articulated in the creeds, but we'll keep going forth. We have another concern, which is that, well, that's the only kind of sense we understand the Trinity. We only understand the Trinity within these later philosophical frameworks. This was the main claim of the Arian heresy that we had prior to the Council of Nicaea. The idea here was, listen, like, Jesus is divine, but he's a mere creature. There's no language of being fully equal with the Father and sharing the same nature. That's just not what we see. And there's big, large factions of debate that were happening in the ancient church. Another popular view is that the scriptures merely give us seed forms. You could say seedlings, that we only have the seeds of the doctrine of the Trinity, but we don't have anything close to a full-fledged doctrine within our scriptures, explicitly nor implicitly. Okay, well, I'm going to be honest with you guys right now. When I refer to the Trinity, and I refer to the Trinity in the Bible, the Trinity is not going to be one that discusses language like substance or nature or essence or hypostasis or Godhead. And so anyone who wants to ask a question concerning these ideas here, don't, because that is not what this presentation is about. You will see where this is going, and this is often where a lot of the logical problems that people struggle with come from, is because they're trying to think within these terms. And basically right now, I'm telling you, we are going to think of the Trinity without any of these concepts whatsoever. We are not even going to approach them. We're not even going to be within the same ballpark vicinity, football field, whatever you want to say. We're not even going to be close to these terms here. But we're still going to be able to get a Trinity. Okay. The creeds will say things like one God. This is the Nicene Creed, by the way. I'm not going to read the full thing, but Nicene Creed is something that all of you should know. It's the general statement of faith in the 3rd century, as the council concluded with having Trinitarianism win out over Arianism. We have things like one God, true God from true God, one essence, proceeding from the Father, the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, things like that. And again, These are what the creeds say. And I'm going to say this. I believe the creeds. I trust in the creeds. I think the creeds are true. And I think that these are actually constitute in some way later revelation from the things that God is revealing. But I don't think that these things are in Scripture. Essence, true God of true God, these kinds of things. Having, rigid philosophical frameworks using Greek philosophy is just not what we find in the Scriptures. So it helps to go over exactly then what are the historical models of thought around the Trinity itself. Well, there's actually three models. The first model is Model A. And this is the idea, and don't be afraid by what seems to be a complex diagram here. It's basically what this model is saying is that there is a long and complex relationship between Paul, the apostle, his own theology, and then later Trinitarian doctrine. And so you see here we have Second Temple Judaism leading up to Paul, because Paul is within the Second Temple context. And then we have later over here the Trinity, and it just seems kind of complex and disconnected. And the idea here is there is no logical necessary path from Pauline theology to later dogmatic articulations of the Trinity. This is a common view. And this is going to be a view held by those who are Unitarians, those that are of other faiths, such as Islam, such as LDS, such as Jehovah's Witness, and many, many others. We have a second model, Model B. And this model is a bit different. It affirms like a greater continuity between Paul in his context and then the later dogmatics of the Trinity. But it's more seen as a kind of a development. Where Paul kind of gave us the groundwork, but he never actually conceptualized anything with the Trinity himself. So like if we were to go back in time and go, Paul, do you believe in this? And we were to show him the creeds, Paul would probably be like, this doesn't really make any sense to me. Or not necessarily doesn't make sense, but this is not my own thinking. So Paul gave us the groundwork, and we build on the groundwork, kind of standing on the shoulders of giants there. So he gave us what we needed, but he didn't conceptualize anything himself. And then we have a third popular model, which is more of a hermeneutical approach. It's more of an interpretive lens that views the later Trinitarian categories as tools we can actually recursively use to actually interpret Paul's language. So we can actually treat under this model Trinitarian doctrine as just a different kind of grammar for the content that Paul gives us. But what's similar to Model B is that in this model, again, Paul himself doesn't literally believe in his own mind the Trinitarian categories. So those are the three main models. Okay, well, I'm going to show you a rival model to those three models that have been historically thought about. Let's get into this argument. First, we need to lay down some groundwork. We need to understand how the Jewish people thought, the Jewish background. And it starts with what's called the Jewish Shema. And the Shema is simply Israel's covenantal monotheistic confession. You can read this in Deuteronomy 6:4. Yahweh says, "Hear, O Israel, nation of Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And this is often what you read when you go to motivate the idea that, hey, Israel is monotheistic in their faith. Judaism is monotheistic. And what's important about this verse is that it sets Israel apart from the other nations who we would actually deem as polytheistic, like the Canaanites, who had a plurality of divine beings that they believed in, that were running the show, right? That's the whole kind of idea here. I want you to just stick this in your back pocket for later. We're going to revisit the Shema, and this is actually going to do a lot of heavy lifting for us. But this is later on. But this is right here, the Jewish Shema. This is Israel's covenantal monotheistic confession. This is them committing themselves to one God right here. Okay. Well, we also have to understand exactly how the Hebrew Bible uses the word that we would often translate God or gods, and that is Elohim in the Hebrew here. And this is going to be the primary name for when, for example, Yahweh or the Father is mentioned. It's going to use the word Elohim. But actually, a lot of scholarship has been done on the use of this word, and I want to unindoctrinate you here. Elohim isn't actually going to pick out a nature of anything. So again, we're not talking about natures, and we're not talking about essences. Elohim is actually going to be arguably a term for a generic spiritual place of residency. It's more so of a category or a kind of a space or a realm, rather. It would be like saying that you live in the Hollywood Hills. Okay, the Hollywood Hills doesn't articulate human nature. It doesn't give you facts about human nature. It's just a place of residency. You're a resident of the Hollywood Hills. You live there. And that's essentially what the word Elohim is actually saying more accurately here. It's a place of residency term. And so in the Jewish background here, we can actually see this circle representing all of the Elohim realm, this place of residency. And we have Yahweh on one side occupying his own land, you could say. This is Yahweh's real estate. And on the other side, you have all other Elohim. Now, what's really interesting about this is actually how the Jews viewed their monotheistic commitment, is that God was actually transcendent and unique amongst all other in the Elohim. Now, Elohim is actually just going to refer to anything that is going to be considered a spiritual thing. So, for example, when I die or you guys die, you will actually be considered an Elohim. Angels are considered Elohim. Demons are considered Elohim. And of course, God is considered Elohim. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is that the fact that Yahweh actually occupies a unique and privileged space amongst all other Elohim. And it is for the Jews to be monotheistic that their direction of devotion is in the direction of the Yahweh only slot within the entire space of Elohim. Dr. Michael Heiser, who has written a lot on this, you can read his book Supernatural and Unseen Realm if you want more broader understanding of this. He's an Old Testament scholar. He passed away, I think, in 2023. He says the biblical use of Elohim is not hard to understand once we know that it isn't about attributes. What all figures on the list have in common is that they are inhabitants of the spiritual world. In that realm, there is a hierarchy. For example, Yahweh possesses superior attributes with respect to all Elohim. But God's attributes aren't what make him an Elohim, since inferior beings are member of that same group. The Old Testament writers understood that Yahweh was an Elohim, but no other Elohim was Yahweh. He was a species unique among all residents of the spiritual world. So Yahweh here is not being understood numerically. It's not being understood as how many things can you count, right? Okay, we have one being, two beings, three beings, but rather Yahweh is going to be thought of in terms of his superiority, in terms of his supremacy, in terms of his, what you could call transcendent uniqueness amongst all other Elohim. And so for the ancient Jewish monotheism, it actually isn't how we understand really today monotheism at all. It is not the belief in only numerically one God, where you just simply count one. That's not at all how the Jews viewed monotheism. But unfortunately, like, this thinking is actually inherited and passed down. We've actually all been indoctrinated into it from later, like, post-Enlightenment European deistic thought. It has nothing in common with the ancients and the Jewish people. I mean, oftentimes, actually, this is how a lot of biblical scholarship actually gets messed up, is that it actually, what ends up happening is that post-Enlightenment European ideas get imposed on a text that's Middle Eastern, right? That has nothing to do with the way that those people thought. And that's exactly what's wrong here with our understanding of monotheism. So the first thing here is we have to understand the way the Jews thought about monotheism had nothing to do with head counting. It had everything to do with, is Yahweh separate from the entire Elohim, anybody who occupies that realm. That's all that it was referring to. And so even Dr. Sijawadi here, who's one of the foremost scholars on the Trinity, monotheism today, and Orthodox Christology, he says monotheism is an inappropriate term for biblical teachings. As Fredrickson, the scholar, notes, ancient beliefs centered on loyalty to ancestral traditions rather than mental assent to propositions. These scholars point to explicit biblical passages that appear to acknowledge the real existence of other divine beings. And again, read Michael Heiser, Unseen Realm, and Supernatural. You can actually listen to both those books on audio on Spotify if you have it. For instance, when Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 describes Yahweh allotting the nations to other gods, or when Psalm 82:1 depicts God standing in the divine council amongst other gods, these texts seem to presuppose the actual existence of these beings rather than merely acknowledging that some people believed them. What this is essentially saying is that for the Jewish worldview, they had no problem acknowledging the existence of multiple divine beings. That never made them polytheists ever in the Jewish understanding of monotheism. Really hang on to this. So now that we have a definition of monotheism, this is what we can actually say. It's a religious worldview that acknowledges the existence of multiple divine beings, Elohim, while maintaining that Yahweh alone was uniquely supreme and that exclusively worthy of worship due to his transcendent attributes as sole creator and sovereign ruler of all reality, rather than a belief system focused on numerical oneness of deity. I really like this definition because it puts us right where we need to be. Right now, we have the backbone of what we need to be able to actually see that we have all the tools we need to see a Trinity within the scripture. We're only in the Old Testament right now. And so when we come back to the Shema and we read, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one," the earliest Jewish people just kind of would look at that and go, okay, we don't believe in multiple figures that we can call Yahweh because Yahweh is one, right? That's the general objection here. Well, the response to this objection is that, well, it has nothing to do with numerical oneness, as we've already seen in other places for how monotheism is properly construed, but rather scholars actually today working on this say that it's better understood as Yahweh is our God, the only Lord for you.
Hey, Tim, can you turn off your camera real quick? I think we're getting a little bit of connection issues.
Oh, yeah. It's probably me on my end. Am I good now?
Yeah, you're good.
I'm good? Okay, perfect. So going on with the Shema objection here, Yahweh is our God, the only Lord for you is actually seen as a more accurate translation because in this particular point in time within the Jewish people, they are dealing with tendencies towards idol worship and worshiping other nations' gods. And so what Yahweh is wanting from them is to not direct their devotion into multiple places in the Elohim, but rather direct their devotion in a unidirection. It's a unidirection of devotion, which is into the Yahweh-only occupancy, kind of referring to that first figure, that first little diagram I showed you guys earlier. We have Joel Cordiocco, I think that is how you say it. And he says something like this. By the way, he's a Hebrew scholar and Greek, and he says that a strong case can actually be made when doing a linguistic analysis of what it means for something to be one. And we find that the best way to understand this is that the Lord is one means the Lord is the only one for you. This is a devotional understanding. The Lord is the only one you are to devote yourself to. It's not saying that there aren't multiple identities referred to as the Lord. It's just saying that whatever is referred to as the Lord, that is what you devote yourself to. So you can look at things like Zechariah 14:9, where it says, on that day, the Lord will be one. But obviously this can't mean numerical oneness as in counting, right? As though on that day, Yahweh will only be one ontologically, referring to his very being, rather than on that day, Yahweh will be the only one for anyone, the one that is solely praised, the one that is solely worshipped. And so this seems to actually be a Hebrew phrase to only understood in a relational sense. Now we understand that the monotheistic commitment for the Jews was a relational understanding of monotheism rather than a quantitative understanding. And so we have scholars like Richard Bauckham who actually argue that Yahweh's oneness is qualitative, and that oneness can actually refer to uniqueness, Yahweh's uniqueness to Israel. What distinguishes Yahweh, the only true God, from all reality? In what does his uniqueness consist? These characteristics make a clear and absolute distinction between the true God and all other reality. It has to do in ways in which Yahweh is unique. So when we center ourselves on uniqueness and not counting identities, we can have a better understanding of what it means for God to be God within the scriptures. So now we go back to the Jewish background. The concern was actually for who Yahweh is, not what Yahweh is. So zero talk of natures, zero talk of essences, no talk using abstract metaphysics. How can three be one? That doesn't even prop its head up in this discussion. Yahweh has what we can actually call uniqueness identifying attributes that to properly refer to Yahweh would be things like attributing to him sole creatorship, eschatological judgment, salvation, prayer, and worship. We can actually call these things Yahweh only roles. Only Yahweh can be said to actually be attributed these things. We call them uniqueness identifying attributes. So the question is, how do I know when I've interacted with Yahweh? Well, is sole creatorship owed to him? Is eschatological judgment owed to him? Is salvation owed to him? Prayer and worship. These things are uniquely for Yahweh alone. Again, we're not counting identities. We're looking at uniqueness identifying attributes. And by the way, any identity within the Jewish worldview that is given any one of these attributes, that is considered Yahweh. That is what we're doing here. So the test is, if there's any identity that is being given these attributes, that is Yahweh. So in Second Temple Judaism, then, God is not defined by essence language at all. God is defined by exclusive worship, exclusive devotion, and covenant loyalty. That is it. It's a relational, devotional understanding. Our knowledge of who God is has everything to do with how we relate to God. So you imagine you're walking in the Second Temple period and you find a Jew and you see them praising and you say, who are you praising? They would say Yahweh, for Yahweh alone is worthy of worship. Okay, you would know that that's what it means for that Jew to be monotheist. That's literally it. They had their system going for them. Like, that's pretty much it. And so moving forward, we see that in the Second Temple period, right? I think this is between 516 BC to 70 AD, I believe. God's identity is expressed through relational patterns. Like, that is how you understand the identity of God. Remember, it's not the whatness of God. Whatness refers to nature. What am I? A human. Who am I? I'm Tim Howard. So God, Yahweh's identity is understood through relational patterns. Okay. Now let's move into the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is the one who will make the argument for us, and we have all the groundwork we need to be able to ascertain a Trinity. Paul is educated within the Second Temple context. Paul was from the line of Benjamin. He knew the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch, if you guys ever read the Book of Enoch, articulates a lot of the Second Temple period thinking of the Jews. So when Paul uses these uniqueness identifying attributes in his writings, in his letters, he's doing it purposefully. He's not accidentally doing anything. Everything Paul is doing is deliberate. He's very educated. And Paul, just like any Second Temple Jew, would have viewed the divine identity through this relational framework. So for Paul, the Yahweh only slot is occupied by the Father, Jesus, and the Spirit. And so Paul engages in what we call identity inclusion. And included in the Yahweh only slot is the Father, Jesus, and the Spirit. And that is what we mean when we say Yahweh. So when I devote myself to Yahweh, I am devoting myself to the Father, Jesus, and the Spirit all at the same time. And that is still going to occupy those attributes that make Yahweh different than all other Elohim. So Paul gives us then 4 relational patterns. We have the God relation, the Christ relation, the Spirit relation, and the believer relation. And if you read I really recommend you guys do this today. Go and read all of Paul's writings in the New Testament, and you will literally be able to find all of these relational patterns that Paul deliberately uses. And the very work of Chris Tilling on this subject has greatly influenced my sympathies towards this view. The God relation. What is the God relation? That is God's transcendence, his uniqueness and supremacy over all, and that's what makes God God. We have what's called the Christ relation, referring to Jesus Christ, obviously, that God, the God relation, is expressed in terms of both Father and Lord, not one or the other, but both. Then we have the Spirit relation, and that is like the mediating, that actually, like the Spirit mediates and actualizes both the God and Christ relations. And then we have lastly the believer relation, how we actually participate in this triunity of all three relations. The Spirit actualizes and mediates the God and Christ relations in the life of the believer. The Christ relation is God expressed in terms of Father and Lord, and the God relation just focuses on the transcendent uniqueness and supremacy God has over all, which is what makes God God. So now we can see how it's backed up in Scripture. Here are the divine identity markers: worship, prayer, covenantal loyalty, and salvation trust. Back to Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, for your Lord is one, for your Lord is unique, for your Lord is for you. Romans 11:36. Referring to Christ, from him all things were through him, and of him all are all things. 1 Corinthians 8:6, part A. There's one God, the Father, from whom are all things. Notice the all things language, right? That your Lord is one, from all him are through all things are all things. We have sole creatorship here. We have supremacy language here. These are the uniqueness identifying attributes. These are Yahweh only languages. We have Paul relating Jesus in the same way, not as an agent, not as a delegate, not as an exalted creature. This is the interpretation Alex O'Connor likes to use. But we have places like Romans 10:9-13, where Paul actually writes Romans 10:9-13 to mirror Joel 2:32. This is a Yahweh only text that's actually applied to Jesus. And this is about every knee bowing, right? And everything being subjugated. And I actually have it here. Because you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. When we see that being actually mirrored all the way in Joel, it also happened that everyone in the name of the Lord will be delivered. And it's referring to on Mount Zion. So we have name of the Lord in the Old Testament, where we have one Yahweh figure, and yet we have the Lord in the New Testament being referred to as Christ, being put in the exact same slot that the Jews would have only put Yahweh in. Okay? Same thing with Philippians 2:9-11 and Isaiah 45:23. These are called Yahweh only attributions. And we're going to get very specific in these texts here, but I just want to make sure that I cover all the bases here. So we're kind of going to speed run this. We have the Spirit relation, that God's own presence and identity are in action. That Romans 8:9-11, that the Spirit of God is actually the Spirit of Christ as well. There's a Spirit of God is the Spirit of the Father and the Spirit of Christ, and it has agency. Romans 5:5, God's love poured into our hearts through the Spirit, again, giving it agency. 1 Corinthians 3:16, that you are God's temple, God's Spirit dwells in you, right? Referring to an actual object, not speaking in any kind of metaphor. And then 2 Corinthians 3:17, the Lord is the Spirit, right? What we're seeing is that Christ and the Spirit are being put on the same level as Yahweh. And anything that occupies the Yahweh only role, that is the divine identity of Yahweh. That is the second temple view. That is the second temple consciousness of the Jew. And then we have the believer relation, right? This is how we as believers actually be able to participate in this divine life, right? Galatians 2:20, that Christ lives in me, he says. Romans 8:10, that Christ is in you. Colossians 1:27, Christ in you, the hope of glory. John 17:21-23, participation, it describes participation in divine unity, right? And remember that the Christ relation, the God relation, and the Spirit relation are always present. So when Christ is living in you, that's been actualized through the Spirit, right? And you are being united with the Father. So there's a tri-unity taking place, right? Not only within the three relations, but also in the believer. So here's some more Yahweh exclusivity evidence. Let's talk about sole creatorship. Yahweh is the only one attributed to being the creator of all. Well, we see that Jesus, articulated as the Logos, in Colossians 1:16-17 says, by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Wait a minute. So Christ, the Lord, right? The title Lord is what's given to Christ, is for Paul responsible for the creation of all things? When we look in the Old Testament, it is only Yahweh who has created all things and supreme over all. But is through Christ all things are created? Jesus is being attributed something that only Yahweh can be attributed. And for the Second Temple Jew, and remember, Paul's very educated. He understands his Second Temple Judaism. He knows exactly what he's doing when he's doing this. He's putting Jesus on the same level as the Father. Another one, salvation, right? Salvation is only by Yahweh. Well, we have Jesus, the Logos, saving in 10:9-13. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is Lord. There's no mediation, there's no delegation, there's no intermediary here. Jesus is Lord. And believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, friend of the Father. You will be saved. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And again, mirroring Joel 2:32 in the Old Testament. It's a Yahweh only text. Applies it to Jesus. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Just like sit here for a second. Paul's deliberately doing this. He's again putting Jesus in the Yahweh only slot. Supreme over all. Again, only said to be of Yahweh, which is only seen as the Father in the Old Testament. Let's keep going. We have worship, right? Paul, and this is actually my favorite one. Like, if there is a text of texts, this is my favorite one. It is 1 Corinthians 8:6. Remember the Jewish Shema. Hear, O Israel, for Yahweh is your God, for Yahweh is one. Paul in 1 Corinthians 8:6 duplicates the same exact structure of the Shema, and all he does is he includes Christ as Lord inside it. This is how it reads. Yet for us there is but one God. Okay, reading just like the Shema, the monotheistic confession of the Jews. Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things. And didn't we just say that he attributed to Christ all things? And for whom we live, and there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. He is duplicating the ancient Deuteronomy 6:4 confession of the Jews of what it means to devote yourself to one God, and he puts Jesus as Lord inside it. And this is unanimous among scholars, by the way, that this is what Paul is doing. And remember, inside the Second Temple Jewish worldview, the roles that Yahweh plays are identical to Yahweh's divine identity. He's putting Jesus literally in the Yahweh only role. We see that happening. So according to Paul, we believe in one divine identity, 3 relational expressions, 1 exclusive devotion, and 1 monotheistic faith. This is the relational Trinitarian monotheism that we find in Paul. Paul does this deliberately all over the place, duplicating and reactivating old revelation like in Joel, right? Like in Deuteronomy 6:4, and including Christ and the Spirit within inside them. So we have 3, Father, Son, and Spirit, relational expressions of the single devotion that we have to the divine identity that is Yahweh. This is Paul's Trinitarianism. We don't need to go outside of this. We don't need to start talking about essence. We don't need to start talking about nature. We don't need to start talking about consubstantiality. We don't need any of that. Because Paul already inside his own context as a Second Temple Jew, highly educated within his own religion, understands exactly how to articulate the godship of the Spirit and the Son. And with that, let's get into questions.
We'll go with you first, Ben.
Hey, Tim, thanks for that. That was awesome.
No problem.
Question, when we're talking about the Yahweh exclusive roles and we're talking about soul creation or soul creatorship, couldn't you say that, I mean, typically the language for Christ is it's like creation was through Christ. It's not always saying by Christ. So couldn't you say Jesus was the first creation and all things came through him? And wouldn't that kind of downplay him being put on the same level as Yahweh? I've heard people say this, that like the Jehovah's Witnesses, that Jesus was the first creation and all things were through him. So he's not necessarily on that same level.
Yeah, so there's 2 things happening there, and I actually like that you actually point out the Jehovah's Witness interpretation. So for the Jehovah's Witnesses, they're Neo-Arians. And for everyone that doesn't understand what that means, basically that Jesus is a creation of the Father, that there was a time in which Jesus did not exist as divine, and then there was a time, and then God basically uses Jesus from that point, kind of delegates that mission to Jesus. But again, you can have that interpretation. But when we understand exactly what the Jewish worldview is inside the Second Temple period, and how we understood the idea of exclusivity of role, and how role is identical to divine identity, well, then you have a problem, right? Because, and then you have other places, right, where Jesus actually pre-exists creation. And so what they would have to basically say is, okay, yeah, well, before creation, he just creates Christ and does that. But already in the Old Testament, we already have in Genesis, where what's being attributed to Yahweh alone is creation. That's already what's happening. So we have in the Old Testament that Yahweh alone, for them in that particular time, it's revealed as the Father, is the one that creates. And that's what makes him supreme over the other nations' gods, which is the entire debate that Israel has, their entire relationship and struggle with Yahweh, is this covenantal loyalty problem that they have. And so one of the distinguishing markers between the Canaanite pantheon and Yahweh onlyism, we can call it, is that Yahweh's the one that creates. So then, but if we put Jesus in that slot, right? But you say, oh, but he's only a mediator, right? Well, again, then Paul, being highly educated in the Second Temple worldview, and there's actually there's actually a really good book on this that actually studies Paul's deliberate use of Enochian thought in order to use the Greek word kurios, right, properly, which is, in places, I think I forget where in Luke says Lord, Lord, right, translating Lord. He's deliberately using these things. So what you'd have to end up saying is that Paul is just in this one area, just kind of, he's slipping up, right? He understands exactly the Second Temple Jewish worldview and how roles are identified as the divine identity, and that one of those things is creation, and then attributes it to Christ, but only wants us to think that it's mediation. That's not Yahweh only. This is what we call a complex ad hoc hypothesis in philosophy language, right? You're kind of just having to write that in by hand, right? And it's going to be foreign to the way. And by the way, mediators are talked about all the time in the Old Testament. It's not like I'm saying that there's no such thing as a mediator in the mindset of the ancient Second Temple Jew. But when you look at these things through the lens of uniqueness identifying attributes, like I said, and like I showed, and one of these things is sole creatorship. Okay? It can't be sole creatorship if you're putting Christ not only in the Shema, not only in the Jewish monotheistic confession, but also attributing him and all things through him. Nothing was made without him being involved. So Christ's very activity at that level is on the same level as the Father. And again, we don't need to talk about natures or anything like that. It's just like, does Jesus exist in that Yahweh only slot? And if we can apply sole creatorship to Christ, then he does belong in that slot. And all we're having to do is think with inside the Second Temple Jewish worldview. And the second thing I want to say is, like, this is why this was such a controversial issue for the Jews up until the codification of Jewish orthodoxy, where they were fine talking about even two figures in the Old Testament, angel of the Lord, the word of the Lord, things like that. That there were these would seem to be actually depicted as two Yahweh figures, and it wasn't until the codification of Jewish orthodoxy where the view now is they're actually pretty much modalists. They think that's just kind of two modes of the Father. That they were actually very comfortable talking about these things. So before it was considered heresy under Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism, which came much later, they were very fine talking about these things. But again, all that matters, right? Remember the framework. That's one framework you're given, but remember, according to the logic of this framework, anything that occupies that role is Yahweh-exclusive, is Yahweh.
Awesome. Does that help answer your question? Okay, you can go with your second one.
Thanks, that's helpful. I had a question. And I don't know, we don't have to go super deep into this because it's huge. But
Okay.
what did the role of the early church play? How they're getting really into Greek philosophy and kind of different, metaphysics, with Plato and all this stuff. Like, how did the early church and all their, philosophy play into this change, but from like a Second Temple Pauline kind of framework to a very, essence energy, all this stuff, homoousion and stuff like that. Like, where do you see it as is it an organic development, or was it like just a result of the underlying metaphysics?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So the way I see the question here is was the church kind of was de novo coming up with a Trinitarian doctrine with their complex philosophical frameworks, or were they in line? And honestly, I think that you can just modify the first part, which is I don't think it's de novo, and I also think at the same time it's in line with the Jewish precedent established before them. Again, the early church did this one thing really, really well, which is what they were facing within their context was heresies run rampant, and they wanted clarity. And listen, I study analytic philosophy for fun. I'm all about precisification, making things concise, slowing down, and using terms. And what the heck do we mean by this? Not in the loose sense, but the strict sense. And essentially, what ends up happening is that as the Gentile mission is being achieved, you move from a Jewish only way of looking at things, and thus comes the integration and incorporation of other frameworks that are going to help those who are Gentile believers actually understand exactly the nature of God. That's where we start to get into these cultures. Remember, the Jewish culture didn't see things in terms of nature, abstract metaphysics, but in other places they do. And so for me, I don't have any problem with a Greek Gentile believer going, hey, I live within this cultural milieu where we do discuss the nature of causes and essence and these different things like that, or this Neoplatonic worldview. And they say, okay, what if we were to use our tools of language and our conceptual frameworks, and what if we were to understand that for us, right? I mean, even Paul talks about this. To the Greek, I am Greek. To the Jew, I am a Jew, right? Being all things to all people. And essentially that is as the church is exploding, right? Scott McKnight actually writes a really, really good bit of this in his book. I forget his book. It's on Romans. It's his treatise on Romans. But he basically argues that Paul is simultaneously in Romans as well, having to deal with this explosion in Rome of Christian citizenship, and then this demonization of Judaism, where Jews are kind of getting pushed out, but the only thing they can really hang on to is that they have the identity of God's people ethnically, and we have the church growing, and Paul's trying to figure out how to harmonize the two, which is why you get two different arguments of Paul going, nothing about being ethnically Jewish makes you special, and it's all through faith to the Gentiles, right? Again, he's engaging in harmonization. What you have in the context at that time is that as the church is overtaking Rome, you have less Jewishness coming through. You see the difference there? But that's not to say that there isn't a precedent within the frameworks familiar to or exogenous to Judaism can already allow us to motivate something that we already see in the creeds. That's what I would say.
Yeah, for sure. That definitely helps. Almost as if to say that Second Temple Judaism itself was like Hellenistic in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and then we had a question over here. All right, here you go, Kenan. Oh, okay.
What's up, bro?
What's going on, man?
First and foremost, just so you know, I am not a Trinitarian. I don't believe in the Trinity. I want to say I appreciate your approach, attempting to come straight from the scriptures rather than, what's the word I'm looking for? Rather than going to, like you said, you brought up, I wrote it down, the fallacy of
anachronism.
Anachronism, right? Like retroactively applying later thought onto the scriptures and then reading it out or reading it in rather than reading it out. It's something me and Ben were literally just talking about on Tuesday. That's one of my biggest problems with conceding to the doctrine of the Trinity. But as far as what was gone over, I have a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Yep.
First and foremost, I want to understand what you mean by a place of residency, as far as like the Hebrew term Elohim. What it like? Because I think I understood what you meant, but I want to make sure we're agreeing on terms before, we jump to something else. So, as far as like a place of residency, are you saying it's more of like a categorical or like title, the word Elohim, or are you saying it's like literally like golly, I don't know the term I'm thinking of. Can you kind of just elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, so it's going to function more as a title. It's going to be a title for exactly a place of occupancy, right? Like I said earlier, if you were to if your address was located in the Hollywood Hills, okay, Hollywood Hills is the title of the place that you are a resident of, and you're a resident of the Hollywood Hills. That's probably the closest analogy I can find to exactly how the word Elohim is being used in the Hebrew Bible. It's just a reference to this unseen spiritual realm. and anything within this unseen spiritual realm is going to be considered an Elohim. So like I said, when you and I pass away, right, and we leave our bodies and our spirits go, we will be Elohim too, by virtue of just being occupants of the spiritual realm. And so the relevance of bringing up this point is to get away from this post-enlightenment quasi-European view that Elohim denotes a nature. It doesn't.
I would agree with you there. I don't necessarily agree with the idea of like, okay, let me just clarify. Would you say that it's exclusive to angelic beings?
No.
Okay. Because like what I'm thinking of is like Moses is called God. In the Torah, it says, "Don't revile the gods of your people," referring to like the judges or the rulers.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
like
this
I would
is the work
understand
of
it.
Michael Heiser. Michael Heiser literally talks about how there's a literal divine assembly of literal divine beings that are rulers over the nations within the Old Testament. That's the Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82 worldview.
That's not
That is
what
what's
I
up.
was. Yeah. Like Deuteronomy 32 and 8 for sure. Like I've seen it in the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. It specifically says gods in those two, manuscript traditions, and then Psalm 82.
Sure.
You can interpret that as like literal, the divine council, literal divine beings. But I'm more so getting at the idea of like Moses being called God, or like Jesus saying to the Pharisees, "You are gods." Like, or the law specifically I was referring to in Torah is in Exodus 22, I think, and it's talking about not reviling the gods of your people, meaning like the literal rulers, the judges that were appointed over the people. So I guess I just want to get clarity. Like, could we agree that it's also Elohim is a term that's also used to refer to like literal human beings?
So you're confusing the usage of the term with what the term is referring to, right? So in that way, when we actually read the Old Testament, right, they can use different literary devices using the same Hebrew word Elohim to talk about other things, right? But what I'm saying is that the literal meaning of the term Elohim is its closest meaning or translation is going to just be a generic spiritual place of residency term, right? I mean, even in the New Testament, which is why for God, theos or hotheos is not a helpful term for being able to identify whether we're talking about Yahweh, right, the God of Israel, or right, where Satan is attributed hotheos, right? So we can't just lay out our Bibles and go, okay, where does it say gods, and then boom, call it a day, and then collect as many texts of those as we can.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. What's your next question?
Yeah. I guess we can kind of just shake hands and move on there. So you talked about like the deliberateness of Paul in his writings. I don't see 1 Corinthians 8 and 6 as a quotation or even a reference to the Shema. And I think that there's like some nuance to the word Kyrios, how it's used in
Okay, so
the
let's start with the Shema.
Septuagint.
Let's start with the Shema. Why?
Okay, for sure. You said why?
Why?
Why don't I believe that Paul is referring to the Shema in 1 Corinthians 8 and 6? I don't see it that way. I don't believe that the Kyrios.
But why don't you see it that way?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to explain. So the way he's using that term Kyrios, I would say it's like in the general sense of the term Kyrios, the same way David is called Kyrios, the same way Abraham is called Kyrios, my Lord Adonai or Adoni, right? That's what I would say he's using that term in 1 Corinthians 8 and 6. And I would just go to other places in Paul's writings. And I like the point that you made about the deliberateness of Paul. And I would ask if there's consistency when Paul says that Jesus is God is the Father. Like, how does that make sense if, okay, this is the point I wanted to make. If Yahweh, one second. I just want to clarify real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
If Yahweh is El Elyon, the Most High God, what is it in Greek? I forget it in Greek. El Elyon, the Most High God, Psalm 118 or something like that. 118, 148, something like that. I don't remember. If he's the Most High God, if Yahweh is the Most High God, and Jesus has a God, and we're staying away from the metaphysics, we're just using Paul's literal words, and he's being deliberate, why would he tell us that Jesus has a God that is the Father?
Yeah, so God and Yahweh are two distinct things. And the first part I want to address your first point is you're close, but you're not all the way out of the weeds. You're still connected to your shackles. If Paul was just using kurios, just randomly, that's fine.
Mhm.
But it's a unanimous agreement amongst New Testament scholars that Paul is duplicating the Shema language deliberately, and then he puts kurios inside the Shema confession. So if it was outside the Shema confession, this would just be a trivial point. But because he puts the one Lord inside the monotheistic confession, duplicates its structure to include God the Father and Christ the Lord, that's the deliberateness I'm talking about. It's not just kurios, it's kurios inside the Jewish Shema. That would be the probability, real quick, the probability that Paul did that by accident and then didn't know the ramifications of what he was doing, you'd just be unreasonable to believe that. And that would just be motivated reasoning, and that would just expose bias of wanting to disconfirm Christianity. That's all that would mean. The second thing I want to say is God is a title. Yahweh is a proper name.
Yes.
Yahweh is what we call a rigid designator. God is what we call a title.
Mhm.
The Father is attributed the title God. But Yahweh is a proper name. It's a name of a subject. And a subject can be multi-identitied. And so it's perfectly fine to say that there's a title God attributed to the Father alone, and that is Christ God. But the Father, Son, and Spirit solely occupy the Yahweh only slot, making them Yahweh.
Yeah.
Those are both consistent. So one's a proper name, which is a rigid designator that picks out a subject with multiple members, and the other is just merely a title.
Yeah.
Like Most High. The Most High God, El-Elyon, is a honorific title.
Yeah, and it's an exclusive one at that. The only person, it's hypostasis or something like that in Greek. The only person that's ever referred to as theos hypostasis in the New Testament is the Father. The only person that's ever referred to as
No, it's not. If you smuggle in person, right? Yahweh is a proper name for a subject.
the only subject that is ever referred to as El Elyon or Theos Hypostasis is the Father. That's the only subject.
Is Yahweh.
Yes, Yahweh. Yahweh in the Old Testament, in the New Testament is specifically referred to as the Father is Theos Hypostasis. So the point, and I think you missed it. The point I was making is Yahweh is the Most High God, correct? He's El Elyon.
Yep.
Does Yahweh have a God? And I know this is like very rudimentary.
No.
I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, but if we're not incorporating the nature, essence, hypostatic union, all of that nonsense, if we're not incorporating all of that and we're sticking straight to the scriptures, then if Yahweh is El Elyon, he's the Most High God, Jesus has a God, how do you reconcile that?
You're confusing the titles, right? So Most High God is an honorific title, right? And the debate is over what do you actually attribute that title to, right? That's just going to be a name. That's going to be just a name. That's not going to be predicating an attribute, right? There's a difference between predicate attribution and a name. The proper name is Yahweh, which is the subject we're referring to.
Yeah.
And then you have the title in the New Testament, God, in Greek, ho theos, right? And in context, we know exactly how these terms are playing with one another. So the correct part here is that Most High refers to Yahweh. Yahweh is a rigid designator for a subject. Now the question is, does that subject include a threefold identity or not? Paul gives us the answer. Included in the subject Yahweh is the Father and Christ the Lord. Paul gives us the answer because he duplicates the Shema on purpose to make that argument.
Yeah,
so my question for you,
go for it.
my question for you, right, is you have to think within inside that framework in order to object to that framework. So working within the rules of this framework, are you picking out a logical inconsistency that Paul doesn't
Yes.
understand what he's saying, or like
No.
what's the actual objection? Okay, so if there's no objection here, then that's how the framework works, and we're good.
No, I'm saying I don't think Paul is being inconsistent, and I don't think he doesn't know what he's saying. I think that the way that he's using kurios in 1 Corinthians 8 and 6 is the same way that Abigail referred to David as her Lord and her king, because Christ is king. That doesn't make him Yahweh. The word kurios doesn't exclusively mean Yahweh.
Yeah,
And I think
no one's saying that. Here's the thing.
I know.
No
I know
one's saying that.
I
It's
know
the
you're
use of
not
the
saying
Shema.
that. No,
right?
yeah, and that's what I'm saying though, because the Shema says, Shema Israel, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Elohim. Yeah, no. It's not. It's Yahweh. It doesn't say Adonai Elohim. It says Yahweh, Elohim, Yahweh Echad. Right. So it doesn't say Kyrios. It says Yahweh. So I think it's very important to identify that Yahweh, the Most High God, is being spoken of there. Correct? In the Shema.
In Deuteronomy 6:4.
In Deuteronomy 6:4, that's talking about Yahweh.
Yeah, so where's
and
Yahweh? Real fast. I want to really get to the point here, because it's great that you have your questions or whatever. But what happens in this conversation is that you say one thing, which is you understand the framework that I'm saying that Paul is using, and then you make an objection as though you don't understand the framework. This is not a dig at you. This is not a, well, hold on. This is not a dig at you, but yeah, that you can disagree, but what matters if your disagreement's actually grounded. So let's go here. If in the original Jewish Shema, it's "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is your God, for Yahweh is one," and it's unanimous scholar attestation that in 1 Corinthians 8:6, Paul is duplicating and reactivating the same confessional structure, but makes a modification to include Christ as Lord.
Are these scholars Trinitarian?
These are, you can ask this to Bart Ehrman. He's going to agree on this. Okay, so now that we have that, right? And even if they were, that doesn't defeat a sound argument.
No, I'm not saying it defeats it. I just think
but pay attention. Putting kurios within the Shema, right, is the context that we want.
Slow that down. Because how would the Shema be written in Greek? Kurios would be there, right? If you look in the Septuagint, Kurios is there. So did Paul put it there?
What do you mean did Paul put it there? It's just going to be a Greek, or it's just going to be the Shema in Greek. That's all it's going to be.
That's what I'm saying though. That's the point I'm making. Paul's not putting that there. That's you said Paul put that there, like for the reason of quoting the Shema. That's where I disagree with you.
Yes, that's what scholars agree on. Yes, that's what Paul is doing.
I disagree with scholars too.
Okay, that's fine though. But you said earlier, right? This is the point. You said earlier that you disagree because you don't think Paul's doing that. I asked you why, and then you just gave me the justification, which is why I just disagree with scholars. And by the way, anyone in this room is allowed to disagree with scholars.
For sure.
But the arguments you've made so far for doing that, I don't see a explicit connection between your supporting premises and like this explicit and clear.
Can you steel man my position real quick?
Like I'm gonna be honest with you, bro. We've gone around in so many different places. I don't even really know what to anchor myself to.
That's what I'm saying, though.
Here, we can end on this. We can end on this. Go ahead and give me just a very basic premise by premise to conclusion argument with an explicit therefore with supporting premises for why you disagree with the unanimous attestation of scholars of Paul using the duplication of the Shema to include Christ as Lord inside of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know if you can hear him.
You can go ahead and reply and then reply one last time.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah,
give the argument that I'm going to reply and then we're going to move on.
Sounds good. So cool. I'm just going to steel man my position. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 36, Peter says that God made Christ Kyrios and Christos, Kyrios and Messiah. God made him Kyrios. I would say that Paul is explaining Jesus as that Kyrios the same way that Peter is saying that that God made Jesus the Messiah. He made him the Lord. The same way that he made that he made King David Lord is the same way that he made his son Lord. And the same way that Peter is using Kyrios in Acts 2:36 when he says God made Christ Kyrios is the same way that Paul is using Kyrios. He's saying there's one God and one Lord of us. The same way David was Israel's one Lord at the time when he was king, when Abigail fell to her knees and worshiped him, the same word that's used as worship to God, the same word that's used it is the same word. And I can show you in Exodus 24, it's the exact same word.
That you know what I'm objecting to. Keep going.
For sure. But that would be my position.
But like make it quick.
Yeah,
though,
that's my position. Plain and simple. The same way that God made David Lord, the same way that he made Christ Lord is the same way that Paul is using it, not the same way as the Shema. I would yield there.
Okay, great. So none of that I disagree with, except for the fact that the meaning of a verb depends on the context by which it's being used. And when you conjugate a verb, these verb inflections, this is just ordinary grammar. What we have in the Greek grammar is Paul is modifying the verb within a particular context, and that is the monotheistic confessional context, which is why he speaks in the structure of the Shema, including Christ as Lord. No one's objecting that he's using Kyrios in some strange way that's foreign to how it's used in other places. He's referring to lordship in terms of enthronement language and in terms of messianic language. But when that enthronement and messianic language is in the context of a monotheistic confession, that's where then we can actually ascertain the interpretation that Paul is putting Christ as Lord on the same plane as the Father. That's my reply there. Awesome stuff. Go. Okay. Do we have another one or are we good?
Oh, yes. Hello. Hi.
Hi there.
Hi. I have a question from you, actually. So I was actually reading a little bit from the Bible earlier today, and I was curious about the Holy Trinity. I wanted to see if any people has asked you this before. It's a different type of question, but like, have people ever asked you if that Trinity was to be the case, then how was Jesus was back then through Genesis? Was he through the light, through God, Yeshua? That's all.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So I was curious if many people have asked you this question, actually. So I was going to ask you this.
Yep.
Since Yeshua, which is God, who have said, let there be light, did he made that through Jesus, and Jesus has been there because through Yeshua? If we're talking about that through...
Are you saying that the position is that Jesus is the one that created the light?
No. Yeshua.
Yeshua is Jesus.
I mean, God, because like there's different versions how it's yes.
Right, yeah, Yeshua.
Yahweh. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I meant Yahweh.
Yeah, both Y names. I totally understand. Both Y names. Yes. So are you asking that when we read in Genesis where Yahweh is engaging in his creating activity of the light, are you saying that according to the Trinitarian position, would that mean that's actually Jesus doing that?
Oh no, that would be Yahweh doing that, not Jesus.
Well, I mean, the Trinitarian position is that Jesus is Yahweh.
Mm-hmm. Then my answer would be yes. Through Yahweh, though.
Yeah, Yahweh is, that goes back to my original point in the presentation, that a uniqueness identifying attribute that makes Yahweh Yahweh and set apart from these other gods is sole creatorship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I was just curious on that question, but thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
Real quick, we don't have any more questions, right? All right, let's give it up for Tim Howard.
Thank you all.
Tim, where can we find you?
Worldview Mastery on all platforms. I'm active on social every single day, long form on YouTube. And I run an academy, a community of people that are constantly going through these types of things. If you want to get one-to-one or one-to-many kind of handles on any objections or just propelling your faith forward in terms of how you advance defending it, I do that as well. So you can find all the relevant links in all those places. Awesome. Thank you guys for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim.
Yep, absolutely.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell for more content. Got questions or ideas? Drop them in the comments below. Until then, next time, thanks for watching. This is Boy Paul signing out. Peace.